Story from Danger Paladin 55. Ruin a department I helped create? Fine, whatever. This goes back decades. I'm almost over it. Not really. I joined a company that was set up as a consultancy to a large corporation to repair their relationship amongst the local community that they were part of. I was in the IT division. I was part of a team of 5 people who installed computers in local businesses, and it ran a billing package for these businesses. We trained their staff and supported everything. This was all done as a low-cost outreach and was very successful. This went fine for about 8 years until the top guy in the company left to join the corporation, and a new guy took his place as director. The new guy, who wasn't really a problem, was more of a paper manager. A genius at it, really. But he left all personnel issues to the department managers. However, he didn't along with the IT manager, and she finally resigned after months of tense standoffs over various policy issues. Now, I was the most experienced staffer, and I might have had a chance to get her job, but the office grapevine said the director had already secretly selected someone himself. This was surprising, as we'd merged with the large corporation, and all hiring was required to go through human resources. But he wanted to be able to replace our manager instantly, so he'd been grooming the replacement, so the moment she resigned, in a fit of anger during a meeting, he had her replaced right away. Remember how I said the director wasn't good at personnel? He wasn't good at hiring and interviewing either. The new IT manager was horrifically unqualified. Her resume was invented from top to bottom. She had no management experience, and as we discovered, she knew nothing about IT. How much nothing? She didn't understand the difference between Macs and PCs. She made a major purchase of new Office software for the entire office. Mac Office software. We ran MS-DOS on PCS at the time. Although Windows 95 had come out a few years earlier, we were locked into IBM PC's WDOS-based applications on a contract with IBM. Her resume boasted a deep programming background, but she didn't know what a subroutine was. It simply got worse and worse. Over the next few years, she deliberately drove out all experienced staff. She would require highly granular timekeeping for all of IT, tracking who called in for support, when we spent support at a business or the corporation, even though there was zero use for this as there wasn't even internal tracking for who used what. When we complied, including tracking the time to track the time, and her increasingly complex needs for details started to take up to an hour each day. The director ended it. She also routinely took personal credit for projects done by her department with no acknowledgement of the actual individual who performed the work. One by one, my co-workers left to other jobs, and in one case, she framed one guy for a failure she caused and got permission to fire him. She replaced everyone with people she had known at previous jobs, regardless of their backgrounds and job skills. A COBOL programmer replaced one of our training and support people. He was a great guy and miserable in the role she put him in. She hired another woman to replace another staff member, but all this woman had done before was author training manuals. Our training materials were all provided under our contract. I never figured out what she did aside from acting occasionally as a personal secretary, which made no sense since we had a secretarial pool, and she got paid 3 times what they got paid. As for me, my wife and I had had our first child around this time, and I simply didn't care about issues of pride anymore. I was careful to CYA myself, because all I wanted to do was bring home a paycheck for my family. The IT manager took credit for everything I did. I was careful to document my work, and in many cases, her taking credit failed because it was too obvious she wasn't involved. She moved on to trying to get me fired. Anyone who has done customer computer support knows that you will get customers you just cannot make happy. Usually just a personality conflict. In the past, we simply traded the call off to another member of IT staff, and that would often do the trick. My manager tried to inflate all of these to finable offences. To my face, she would promise to have my back. As the original IT manager always did, she loved her staff and would take a bullet for us. Behind the scenes, she tried to build a case against me. The first time I realized this was a meeting between the director, one of our business consultants, my manager, and myself. I'd been given a heads up by the business consultant, and when I walked into the meeting, I had all my notes on my supposed failures. She made her pitch to the director, but the business consultant and I destroyed her and demonstrated to the director she was inventing things. She was humiliated, and I remained unscathed. The second time, an assistant manager at one of the businesses I'd recently installed a computer system at raised a huge stink. He'd been following me around during the install and questioned me. Turns out he was trying to set up a system at home to call into his office to get onto the network, which back then was a bigger deal than it is today. However, I'd actually done this for another business, but not this one. He'd made some random guesses as to what he needed and wasted $5,000 because it was all IBM hardware, software. He blamed me. Again, the IT manager told me she'd reviewed my notes and knew I was blameless. I wasn't stupid enough to believe her again. I got the business consultant to go to the head manager at this business and ask about this. It turned out the assistant manager there had never requested remote access internally, and the entire staff there supported my version of events. Of course, my manager once again had tried to escalate this to a major failure. Remember those detailed notes / timekeeping she had wanted? Well, even though the ridiculous depth of them was gone, I still kept them. She called another meeting, this time inviting senior management from the corporation as well. It was another embarrassing moment for her. I refuted all the claims made by her and the assistant manager of the business, and with documentation. My good friend, our business consultant, backed it all up, and the cherry on the top? The head manager of the business called the senior management at our corporation to apologize for his assistant manager and to praise my work. My manager looked like the idiot she was. All because I continued to comply with the task, timekeeping she originally instituted to drive the old staff out. Now, she kept her job, mainly because our director would have to explain why he hired someone so clearly unqualified, and he couldn't because he violated HR policy to do so. But I know you readers out there want to hear some juicy revenge as well. That weekend following that meeting, a major business's entire computer network I'd installed went down after a lightning strike. I remotely diagnosed it and knew it needed a simple hard drive replacement and a restore from a tape backup. I came in Monday. Before I could leave to fix the client, she called me into her office. She offered me a 3-month severance package, full pay, benefits, etc. They only offered these to management types normally. She hated me and wanted me gone. I told her I would gladly accept it, but didn't she want this client fixed? It was kind of a big deal. She said no. While I signed the legal paperwork, she rambled idiotically about my job performance, etc. But I just finished signing, took my copy of the papers, and told her that she didn't know anything about what she was talking about, and this severance proved that. I packed up my office, said goodbye to my friends, many of whom were shocked and crying over this, and I can't deny I was a little wet around the eyes too. I told them it wasn't a problem. And you know what? It wasn't a problem. I'd been building my own software company on the nights and weekends for years, with full permission of my original manager. I walked out of there with 3 months of free salary into my own company, which was now paying me more than my old salary now that I could go full-time with my partners. Oh, and my friend who got fired? I used my contacts and found him a job, a better job too. As for my manager, they took over 2 months to figure out how to replace and restore that hard drive to the business that had the lightning strike. I wasn't kidding about her hiring the wrong people for our jobs. That business likely bad-mouthed them because they barely retained 25 to 30% of the businesses as they lost them one by one over the next few years. My friends kept me up to date until they too left. TL, DR. New manager doesn't know it. Runs out existing staff to hire friends who aren't qualified. Finally, it's down to me. And I comply and comply as it ruins the department under her. I walk W a nice severance package into my own company. The malicious compliance was masterclass. The new manager tried to mess up with old employees without knowing the aura of old employees, resulting struggling with managing the company, while OP flew with a golden opportunity. The story from Haddock-Ura. I was told to do what an exec told me in a precast concrete plant. A very long story, but I hope worth the read. Some background first. I worked for a precast concrete company as a job in between high school and college. The job sucked, but it paid well. We made a lot of the massive storm culverts and tunnel pieces that are dropped in place during construction instead of being made where they are. To put this in perspective, our largest casting form could handle pieces 40 feet by 30 feet. Absolutely massive pieces. After a few weeks of working for this company, I was trained to run the industrial concrete mixer and did every day. This mixer was 3 stories tall, mixed up to 4.5 cubic yards of concrete at a time, and was the most beat-up machine in the entire plant, which was saying something. It ran 6 days a week, 2 shifts a day, and was never maintained because the company couldn't get techs to come out on Sunday. Its only day not running, and didn't want to lose a work shift to get it maintained. The only good thing about it was that all the materials were weighed and fed in automatically. All it took was a button to start the process. The most common problem was the bottom release door not sealing correctly. It would be just barely cracked, allowing all the water to run out of it, resulting in an unusable, chunky mess that would need to be dumped in a scrap hole instead of being used. If this happened, the mess needed to be dumped out of the mixer quickly before it could partially harden inside the mixer. This only happened once that I was there, and it took an entire shift to chisel the stuff out. We put a mark into the sliding door to show where it should be versus where it would be when it didn't seal. The process worked like this. A cage of rebar and anchor points was constructed on a base, around a core, and a form bolted around it. The QA guys signed off, and the form was then filled with concrete and left to cure. The curing time largely depends on the ambient temperature. The hotter it is, the faster it cures, and vice versa. Once the piece is cured enough to be lifted, the form is stripped and the piece lifted by crane off the core. Repeat until you have as many pieces ordered. Another thing to note is hard hat colors. They were color-coded according to your role. Blue are plant supervisors, green QA, red the foreman, etc. For the normal workers, there was a choice of 2 colors. Yellow for people who don't know what they are doing, typically new or dumb people, and grey for those that do. This was about 5 months into my time with them, and I had just got a grey one maybe 2 months before. On to the story. Our plant was starting to producing pieces at a substantially slower rate than the other plant owned by the company. We were working 10 to 12-hour days every day to try and make up the difference. Typically, multiple pieces were made per form, per day, 2 to 4. We were only managing 1 and maybe 2 per form, per day. To figure out the reason for this, the owner's plan was to send an executive from the main office to observe and time every section of the process in our plant. This in itself was silly. Remember how I said the speed concrete cures is based on temperature. Our plant was in an unheated warehouse in a state bordering Canada in the winter. The other plant was in Florida. Can you guess why production was a bit slower in our plant? In any case, during the shift meeting before the exec got there, our foreman's exact words were, "Do what he tells you, otherwise stay the f*** away from him." Wonderful. The shift proceeds as normal building cages and forms get bolted. Maybe 6 hours into the shift, I climb up on top of the mixer to the platform, and I am greeted by the exec in the shiniest white hard hat I have ever seen. And office attire complete with black dress shoes. In a concrete plant. LOL. He looked bored out of his mind. He asked me something to the effect of if I was looking forwards to the end of the shift in 2 hours. I told him that with no problems, we might get to leave in 4 hours. He got the most defeated look on his face and mumbled something that I didn't catch. I went through the rechecks on the mixer and found the bottom door was once again not closing properly. I yelled down to the plant supervisor that the door wasn't sealing again and that the machine would be down until I got it to seal, normally by chipping the concrete left by the previous shift after using the mixer away from the opening. The plant supervisor yelled back a few choice expletives directed at the mixer and stormed into his office. The exec had a look and said he thought the door looked fine. I told him that it did this a lot and that it wasn't sealed, pointed out the mark to him, and went to get the tool I bribed a fabricator with energy drinks to make me to chip away the concrete. A braking bar welded onto a rebar shaft that I kept under the mixer itself. No more hunting down an air gun and going through confined space lock and tagouts. Just stand on top and poke at the concrete until the door moves freely. Upon coming back with the tool, the exec told me that the seal was fine and to run it. I pointed out the same things about the door, nor sealing regularly. I asked if they were sure. They replied in the affirmative. I started up the mixer. The mixer regularly threw a bunch of silica up into the air. With the water draining out the bottom, this was going to get extra dusty. I offered them an extra mask that I had, and they replied that they would be fine. Well, it's not my lungs. At the same time, I noticed the plant's heavy equipment guy walking into the building and got his attention and made the hand gesture for the front loader. I got a WTF look from them and they mouthed, "Why?" I pointed down at the mixer, repeated the gesture, and they threw up their hands and turned around. The load went into the mixer, water started draining out the bottom, dust goes everywhere. Go figure. The plant supervisor comes out of the office, assume after seeing the giant cloud on the cameras, runs over and says something like, "OP, what the fuck are you doing?" The mixer is quite loud with concrete in it. I got the general gist though. I just pointed to the exec who was now covered in dust and staring at the water pouring out the bottom of the mixer. Never said a word. The plant supervisor's head swiveled and he just crooked a finger at the executive. The exec climbed down. They exited the building with the plant supervisor leading. The fallout. The front loader was able to get to the mixer before the mess was able to partially cure inside it, so the cleanup was as easy as dumping it into the bucket and then dumping that in the scrap hole and spraying out the mixer. We continued the shift after I chipped the concrete away from the door and got it closing properly again. Not too much time wasted, maybe an hour. The foreman asked what happened later in the shift and didn't stop laughing for the rest of it. The plant supervisor talked to me afterwards, asked what happened, and told me he didn't blame me for that dummard's mistakes, since he had said to do what the exec said. I never saw the exec again, and the plant supervisor never said what happened in the parking lot. I can only assume that the most this produced was angry phone calls and a lot of concrete wasted. I left about 3 months later, but I never heard anything else about slow production times from the main office. TL, DR. An exec came out to observe a precast concrete plant and ended up telling me to press a button on an industrial cement mixer despite my warnings, ending in a lot of concrete being dumped and the exec leaving. The malicious compliance was perfect. By following the exec's instructions despite the clear issues, OP set him up for failure. The resulting mess, coupled with his frustration, was a well-deserved lesson in ignoring experienced workers' advice. Don't mess with old employees. Never, ever. The story from Rugby Player 96. Doesn't matter if the case is closed or not? Okay then, I work in a call centre that primarily deals with the public with issues or queries they have, and whilst we can deal with a lot ourselves, there are a lot of things we must either log for another department to look into or transfer them across to that department. For example, if someone calls about a broken street lamp, they get transferred across to the street lighting team. But if someone calls about a pothole, we have to log it for the highway team to fix it. Some departments don't have an internal number for the caller to get transferred across to a number we can call to speak to that department. And one of those departments is the enforcement department. Of all the systems and departments we use and liaise with, the trickiest one we deal with is the enforcement system. Basically, ranging from food safety to the environment, there were multiple teams that enforced things, and all these issues had to be logged on this system. For example, if someone called to report their neighbour for being too loud, that had to get logged on the system for the noise enforcement team to investigate. But we had to arrange for letters to be sent out about it. If someone reported an abandoned car, we logged it, and the environment enforcement team went out to investigate. If someone said they got food poisoning from a restaurant, we logged it, and the food safety team investigated it and so on. The reason why it was so tricky was because if you missed a step, it didn't get logged properly. It didn't go to the correct team, which meant that someone would complain to your manager about it. And crucially, this was a legal system, which meant that if the issue escalated to court, whatever you wrote in your notes could be used in the court proceedings. This wasn't a second nature, eyes closed kind of system. You needed to be concentrating because something you log can bite you in the arse a month later. For example, when someone calls to say that they haven't received a letter, and it turns out you didn't send it in the first place. The way it worked was that a case was logged, which meant that it was open, and it got assigned to an officer like pulling a name out of a hat, and throughout the time that it was open, if someone called back to give you more information about the case, you could update it. And that update went directly to the investigating officer. And then, when the investigation had finished, the case was closed by that officer. Basically, once a case was assigned to an officer, they had to see it through from start to finish. Whether it was deciding if a noise complaint was justified or going through black bags that were reported as fly tipping to see if they could find anything that tied someone to that rubbish and so on. It wasn't as simple as that though, because there were cases that had been open for years. With multiple updates, there were multiple cases that had been opened and closed between the same properties for the same reasons, or someone had called about something, and you weren't 100% sure if it should be logged or not, etc. I'm not sure how my colleagues dealt with those situations, but whenever I got a call like that, I just emailed the investigating officer just to explain the situation and ask for advice, and CC'd in their colleagues just in case the investigating officer was off. Or I just emailed the team to ask if they wanted me to log it as a new case or not. Since if it was an ongoing situation with multiple cases for the same thing, many officers may have dealt with it and they may not have wanted me to log it as new case. I didn't see an issue with it because they either emailed me back with an answer or they didn't reply but logged it themselves after they'd looked into it. But one day, I got a thorny email from a thornier senior environmental officer, basically telling me off and telling me not to send them emails anymore because the system was there to be used. I emailed him back, explaining that it wasn't that simple because there were tricky cases that I needed help with, and I didn't want to update an old case or log a case if I didn't need to not unnecessarily add to the caseloads of the officers, and he replied back reiterating that I shouldn't send any more emails, and finished it off by telling me to either update the case whether it was open or closed, or open a new case. Cue malicious compliance. From that day forward, I did not send another email. If I got a call about an issue, and the last time the issue was raised in 2017, I updated the 2017 case. If I was on the fence about logging something as a new case or not, I just logged it anyway. If I checked the last case and the investigating officer had left, I updated it anyway. I was unaware of this, but when I told people that the investigating officer would call them back, like they typically did after we asked them to in our updates, they would call us a couple of weeks later to ask why they hadn't received a call, and my colleagues would have to raise a new case for them because the one I updated was closed. The officers also suddenly had an influx of new cases because every time I updated a closed case, it reopened, which added to their caseload. The system they used worked on dates and caseloads, for example. If I asked them to call someone or inspect a property in my update, the system generated a time frame for them to complete that action by. But if they were too busy to do something I'd asked them to do, it went red, which counted against them. Also, for example, if they had 4 open cases and then they closed 3 and they'd gone down to 1, they'd go back up to 4 again if I updated 3 of their old cases, so based on the system, they were not doing their jobs properly because they constantly had open cases. This put their stats through the floor. This went on for ages, and one day I was hauled into an office by my manager, and waiting for me was his manager, the senior enforcement officer. His manager, a HR advisor for me and HR. They told me that I was doing call avoidance, gross misconduct, purposefully misadvising callers and not triaging calls correctly. From what they were saying and the paperwork they had with them, I knew it was a "you're fired" meeting. HR asked me if there was anything I wanted to say, so I looked at the enforcement manager, pointed at the senior enforcement officer and said, He told me to do it. The enforcement manager looked at me, looked at the senior enforcement manager, looked at me again, and then asked me to clarify what I meant. I explained it all from start to finish, making it clear that when I was sending emails, I always asked for advice and offered to log a case for the enforcement team if they wanted me to, and that before the email from the senior enforcement officer, my emails either were not replied to, but someone logged it for me, or someone replied to me to tell me to log a new case, or to not log a new case. The enforcement manager sighed, and then asked me if I could send him that email. So I quickly left, went back to my desk, sent the email thread to him, and came back into the office. He read the email, sighed deeper than he did before, and then asked us all to leave, but asked the senior enforcement officer to stay, and I left with a massive shit-eating grin on my face because I knew that I would keep my job. The fallout was pretty big, because the IT team had to go in and manually close all the open cases so that the stats for the enforcement officers would go back to normal. The payroll department had to backdate all the months that the stats were messed up so that the performance bonus matched what would have happened had I not put their stats down. I didn't know they had performance bonuses until afterwards, and the senior enforcement officer got demoted to an enforcement officer based on their new email signature. A couple of weeks later, when the enforcement manager was less busy, he emailed me to basically say that he gives me permission to go back to emailing the enforcement team about cases, but I should use my own judgment. If I think I could justifiably get away with not logging something on the system, as in I could explain to my manager why I didn't think it should have been logged, then I shouldn't log it, and that logic would cut down the amount of emails I had to send to the enforcement teams. No one got fired, but someone got demoted, and a lot of work happened in the background to fix what I did. The malicious compliance was flawless and was executed perfectly. The arrogant officer got the consequences of his flawed directive, which finally led to his demotion and caused a huge chaos in his team. Story from Sabrina Spellman 1. Solicitor embarrassed me and made me cry 3 times. So I became super efficient at my job. This happened many years ago. I've only just found this sub, and while my story is nowhere near as witty as the ones I'm reading, it still makes me chuckle. When I was around 19, I was working as a receptionist, front of house at a solicitor's office. It was quite small, but very successful. 4 partners. Main one was the lady it was named after, who was kind of fierce in a Judge Judy kind of way, so I'll call her Judy. A new solicitor we will call Anna joined the team. We had a conveyancing, a personal injury, financial and criminal department solicitor, and she would be working family law, and her specialty and main focus would be helping domestic violence victims. At this time, all of the abused clients were women. She was awesome at her job. I saw so many victims of abuse while they waited in reception, and because they were so stressed and worried, they would sometimes just tell me their life stories while they waited. I did my best to comfort them. Sometimes they'd have to wait an hour or longer if something else was happening. Anna advocated hard for these women. Restraining orders, emergency hearings, police interviews, protection, arranging safe houses, custody of children. I really admired her, and still do now. Those women needed her. The thing about Anna was she was extremely posh. Well-educated, she spoke better than the characters on Downton Abbey or even the Queen. But she was also very opinionated, and she swore a lot. Hearing her talk about one of the husbands of a battered woman, what an absolute twitting little cunt, in a voice that sounds similar to the Queen, made us giggle, but she reined it in and was mostly professional in front of clients. Most of my job was filing, typing voice dictation statements, and logging calls from the women with restraining orders who had been contacted by their ex-partner/abuser. So I'd get a lot of calls. Hi Sabrina, he called me at 8:15 a.m. and 10 a.m. today, also an email at 9 p.m. through his mother's account. Things like that. It all had to be logged and reported for the court files. I got so many of these calls I'd recognize each by voice. This is important later. After she'd been there for maybe a month, she was featured in an article that put the office in a very good light. The article highlighted her important work in keeping these people safe. We celebrated with her. But it went to her head, and she became arrogant and snappy, with little put-downs here to the secretaries and other workers. She became pretty full of herself, getting snarky and barking out, "Coffee," to me as soon as she walked inside. I let it go. She was stressed and doing something important. As it was so long ago, most documents had to be faxed. Her office was 2 doors away from reception. She would let me know if she was expecting something important, and I would drop everything to rush the documents to her. Waiting for legal stuff, police reports, or restraining orders could quite literally be a life and death situation for the clients. Sure enough, a restraining order document came through for a female client who was sitting with Anna in her office. She was crying, looked like she had no sleep. Her story was horrendous. I had to type up some statements of hers. I felt desperately sorry for her. The rule was, if something important came through, I had to rush and interrupt any client meeting. The papers came through, I rushed to the office and handed them to Anna and left. Moments later, Anna was in reception screeching at me because the timestamp said it was delivered a whole hour earlier. I was confused I'd given it to her the moment it came through. She would not stop yelling that I had put this woman's life in jeopardy over my laziness and stupidity, and I should be fired. She made so much noise that Judy came out of her office to listen, the founder of the company. Her face gave absolutely nothing away, and afterwards she quietly just said, "Please make sure to give the documents quickly in future to avoid any more problems." It happened again. An 8 or so page document came through for that same client who was in there with her. I rushed to her office, handed them to her, and went to leave. Before I could, Anna started yelling at me again. "This was an hour ago. What the f***, Sabrina? What the f*** did I tell you?" This time, she started swearing, and I couldn't get a word in. And all of this in front of the poor client who looked wildly uncomfortable. Judy came to the door again and again, her face gave nothing away, and just asked me to come with her. She asked if there was a problem, I explained, and she thanked me. Anna then followed us out and started yelling at me that I had no respect or kindness in my heart for these women, and I was lazy, utterly incompetent, and ridiculously not right in the head. I cried in the toilets. Over the next few days, the same client came in. Things had escalated further and had hit the newspapers. It was an awful case, so the 4 partners along with Anna were meeting with her in the same office. I went back in to give a file to one of the other partners there, and Anna piped up, "Was this from an hour ago too? There seems to be a pattern here." Again, in front of the client and her 4 bosses. It didn't bother me this time though. I'd had one of those moments in bed the night before. The moment when your eyes snap open while you're trying to sleep and you have that bingo realization moment. So I calmly just said, "The reason why the documents appeared to be an hour late was because the clocks have changed for daylight savings time. I should have realized that when the ink was still not dry as I handed them to you." Sure enough, the document on her desk yesterday was a little smudged. The fax machine was old and didn't update the time. My little victory moment was spoiled because as I was leaving the office, I tripped over my own foot and knocked my head on the doorframe, giving Anna a good laugh. The next day, a staff meeting was called about professionalism in the office. The client who witnessed Anna's meltdown had approached Judy. She was really upset to see Anna treat the staff that way, and her swearing had frightened her. Judy was very clear that this was not acceptable. The woman had heard enough yelling and swearing for a lifetime. Anna begrudgingly apologized to me, and I shrugged it off. Judy also apologized privately for not stepping in when she should have. No problem. My malicious compliance was next. Every single call I had to log, instead of the main list I used on the computer, from the women I wrote on an individual post-it. So I'd be in and out of her office sometimes 10 times an hour. Her desk was flooded with post-its that just said, "10 a.m. call from husband to client X." She was annoyed, but this was what she asked for. I wasted a lot of post-its. The next bit got a little strange. A lady who was in a shelter safe house with her daughter called and said she was reconciling with her husband and she wants to drop the case completely and did not want to be contacted again. This happens. Sometimes abused victims go back when it gets too much. This was a particularly brutal case. She'd been beaten really badly. I told Anna straight away who said she would call her in a few days. Calling right then might jeopardize her safety if he was there, and I said no. call the police. She asked why, and I said it wasn't her on the phone. I recognize her voice every time she calls. It wasn't her. We called for a welfare check, and sure enough, her husband had taken her forcefully back home and had his older daughter call the office pretending to be her. He was arrested. When it all worked out well, and the lady was again in a much better safe house, Anna gifted me a bottle of wine and a thank you card, and then asked me to stop with the post-its and that the message was received. She also apologized again properly. Sorry for the long post. Moral of the story is don't treat people like crap, even if your intentions are pure, and trying to help someone. We can all be kind. Eat it. Thank you for the awards and kind words. You're all awesome. I think I didn't make clear that I'm not in that field anymore. It was a job I took after dropped out of college. I left after having my first son and then started working safeguarding 1-1 support at a school. The nice comments really made me smile. Thank you very much. Edit 2. I honestly did not think this post would reach so many people, and people with lovely good hearts that would say such nice and genuinely kind things to me. Some people have asked me for a TL, DR, so here goes. TL, DR, I was treated badly and belittled in front of a client and cried in the toilets. I bombarded Boss Anna with individual updates and progress updates on post-it notes, so she would see what I was handling minute by minute. Her office was flooded with yellow post-it notes, and we handled a situation afterwards together. We ended up working together. Thank you for your kind words. It was more of a petty revenge. OP did a wonderful job by standing for himself and getting the solicitor realized her mistake. If you don't stand for yourself, no one care about your respect and welfare. If you really want to live a peaceful life, you must be able to take a stand for yourself. The story is from Nicklo 2K. Either be fired or accept a massive pay cut. Okay, I'll take the firing. I worked for company for 14 years. I loved working there for 12 of those years. There were two main parts to the job. The first part was the sales side of things. This was away from the office, in the customer's location. This involved quite a bit of driving, and on a couple of occasions flying abroad to work face-to-face with the customers to deliver a high-quality product. We weren't the cheapest, but we were the superior product. And I was the best employee when it came to delivering the product. I consistently got rave reviews from customers for my personal style when it came to delivering the product and executing the customer's vision. I got a huge amount of repeat business, and I got a lot of new business through word of mouth, with customers recommending the company based on their experiences with me. The second part was the office side. This was my weaker side. I hated cold calling potential customers with numbers I found in the phone book. When it came to answering the phone and speaking to potential customers who initiated contact with us, I was fine. But I wasn't great at making the calls. This was my only real, not great part of my job. So, in the office, I wasn't asked to make any calls. Instead, I prepared product, designed new product, trained new staff members, ended up being one of the biggest parts of my job. I was also the problem solver, helping out whenever and wherever, filling in for sick employees whenever I could. I liked the owner and I liked the manager. I liked all the staff who were around me. All in all, it was a great job that I was really good at and took pride in. The company had been doing so well that the owner had slowly expanded over the 12 years since I started working for company. I had joined about 3 months after he started, so I'd been a part of this expansion. I worked out of my nearest office, but often travelled to other areas to train their staff. I was loaned out, as it were, to other companies to help train their staff. At one point, I was a guest lecturer at a university teaching medical students how to deliver complicated explanations to people who don't have the base knowledge that you yourself do. After 12 years, I was on a decent salary. Not massive, but I was happy. Then the owner decided to sell off part of the company. He was selling the area where my local office was. He told me he would love for me to remain as his employee, but I would need to work from a different office. This was either require me to move or to quadruple, at a minimum, my daily commute. The other option was to remain working from my current office, but with a new boss. I chose the second option. Before the new owner bought the company, she worked alongside the staff for a couple of weeks to see how we operated. This was before any of us knew she was about to buy the company. As far as we knew, she was just another employee, and she was shadowing us to learn. She came with me on assignments in the field and saw my abilities. When the sale was announced and we were informed that she was the new owner, everyone was very surprised. She made some sweeping staffing changes. The manager left to start her own business, since the new owner was also going to be the manager. A lot of staff were let go. The secretary, myself, and a couple of newer hires were kept on. The new hires were on the lowest wages, not salaries. Anyone who had got to a decent level was let go. Since almost everyone was on a 0 hours contract, she was able to do this. Whilst technically it was a new company for the customers, it was the same old business. The company still had the same trading name. The only real difference was that there was a new owner, and the registered business name was now different. As far as the customers were concerned, nothing had changed. My job for the first few months after the sale was to train up the remaining staff to replace the more experienced staff members who had been let go. I recommended a couple of new hires who I had experience working with in the past. I was open and honest with the owner and let her know that one of them was a close friend and one of them was my girlfriend. Both were more than qualified for the work and both were happy to join. My friend had recently come back to the country after a year of travelling, whilst my girlfriend could only work during school holidays, worked in a school. The owner gave them both interviews, then hired them, since we needed the staff. Over the next 2 years, business started to fall. The reason was simple. The new owner decided to try and maximise profits by increasing prices whilst decreasing the quality of the product. For new customers, this wasn't noticeable. They just thought we were expensive, and the product wasn't the best. But for old customers who had been with us for 10+ years, they immediately noticed. They were being charged more and were receiving less, worse quality. So the owner doubled down and increased prices again. 95% of our old customers left us. New customers almost never became repeat customers. Complaints skyrocketed. Whilst all this was going on, our staff turnover rate was ridiculous. People left after a few months when they realised that the minimum wage they were being paid wasn't worth it. Under the old owner, the average hourly wage for new employees was around 2.5x the minimum wage. This made people care about their jobs and want to keep them. My girlfriend quit. My friend remained, but was looking for something new. Then I got a phone call. The owner needed me to come to the office. This was unexpected. I had just finished working on location with a customer. My next customer was in 2.5 hours. It was a half-hour drive away. The office was about 1 hour and 10 minutes away from both locations. If I drove back to the office, I would have about 5 minutes in the office before leaving. My mileage was paid above my regular salary, so I was saving the company money by doing this. Also, parking was a nightmare around the second location, so I intended to get there as early as possible to find parking, then read a book. The manager didn't care. She needed me to return to the office. So I did. I arrived back to be handed a letter by the owner. It was informing me of a disciplinary meeting to take place in a couple of days' time. I could bring a witness along if I so desired. This knocked me for 6. I was the best employee. I read through her list of complaints about my performance and started working on my defense. At the meeting, I declined to have a witness. Instead, I decided to record the audio of the entire meeting on my phone without informing her. Where I live, this is legal, and I didn't need consent. The boss's witness was her friend who she had met at yoga and hired for an office role, firing the secretary who had been there long before the takeover. Every point she raised I could counter. They ranged from the week. You were unavailable to work for a week in August. I booked a week's holiday so I could attend my cousin's wedding on the other side of the country and turn it into a holiday. To the pathetic, you were late for work on the 12th of May. Is that the day my car broke down and I called the office to let you know? I don't know. I do. Here's the receipt from the garage dated May 12th. To the downright lies. This one I can't write as a quote. Basically, she accused me of gross misconduct for breaking health and safety laws in the way I was delivering a product for a customer. I hadn't broken health and safety laws. I knew exactly what I was doing since, as I've mentioned already, I had been doing this for 14 years at this point. She had witnessed me do this on multiple occasions and had never mentioned it before, because it wasn't an issue. She even had me train staff in this specific delivery method, because it wasn't an issue. No. She finished her list by telling me that she doesn't want to lose me, but she can't justify keeping such a poor employee at my current salary. I had two choices. I could either sign a 0 hours contract and work for minimum wage, or she could fire me with 2 weeks' notice. I counted that she would have to give me 12 weeks' notice, since my contract guaranteed me 1 week's notice for every year of employment, up to a maximum of 12. She argued that I had only been her employee for 2 years, since before then I worked for the previous owner. I informed her that with how the business takeover had run, it counts as continuous employment. I quoted the exact law and code that backed me up. She asked for a 30-minute break in the meeting to let me think about her offer. She went to call her lawyer. When she came back, she informed me that since she was firing me for gross misconduct, she didn't have to give me any notice at all. If I wanted to remain and move to the 0 hours contract, I could do that today. But if I didn't, then she would have to fire me. But because she was nice, she would give me the 2 weeks' notice. I asked for a couple of hours to go home and think about this. She allowed this. I knew the reason she wanted me to remain for at least the 2 weeks was because one of our few remaining bigger customers was set to have a product delivery from me in that time. They would only work with me. The owner had tried sending other staff in my place on several occasions, and each time there had been problems. It wasn't the staff's fault. It was just a very difficult delivery for a very specific customer, which needed to be perfect. As a result, this customer would only deal with me. I called the office and spoke to the owner. I declined the offer of a 0 hours contract and said I would be leaving. She then said she was giving me my 2 weeks' notice. I declined her offer of 2 weeks' notice. I informed her that if I was being fired for gross misconduct, then surely I cannot be relied upon to safely deliver the product. Therefore, it would be best for everyone involved if I didn't return to work. She panicked and said that she needed me for those 2 weeks. I feigned ignorance and let her know that I was just thinking about what's best for the company. After all, you can't have unsafe staff delivering your product to your customers. However, if she wanted to rethink the gross misconduct accusation, then I would work my 12 weeks' notice. They were her options, 0 weeks or 12. She chose 12. For those 12 weeks, I worked the same way I had for 14 years. I didn't coast, I didn't slack, I didn't badmouth the company on my way out. I continued to train new staff. I continued to deliver the product in my own personal, exceptional way. I also got in touch with a lawyer who was a specialist in employment law. For those 12 weeks, the owner barely spoke to me. She resented the fact that I knew my legal rights and didn't just believe her lies. She hated the fact that I could defend myself. She was petty. She accidentally dropped my mug in the kitchen, breaking it. Most petty of all, she paid for every member of staff in the office to have a spa day, except me. I was asked to work my day off to answer the phones whilst everyone else was being pampered. Nobody knew I hadn't been invited until they arrived at the spa, and I wasn't there. Here's the thing. I'm a big, fat, bearded guy. I have no interest in a spa day. If she had offered it to me, I would have thanked her and declined the kind offer. But by pointedly excluding me, she was making herself look terrible. For the last 2 weeks, I was training up my friend to basically take over from me. At the end of the 12 weeks, my final day came around. The owner had nothing planned, not so much as a card after 14 years, 2 for her. The office assistant manager, who had become a friend, had got me some presents, but had to give them to me once the boss was gone for fear of reprisals. The day after my final day, 2 things happened. The first was my friend who I had been training up to replace me quit. He was on a 0 hours contract, so required no notice. He was unhappy with her treatment of me and was unhappy that she expected him to do my previously salaried job for minimum wage. He hadn't informed me of his plans to leave, and I only learned of it when he knocked on my door in the middle of the day when he should have been at work to let me know. The second was the owner received a letter informing her that I was bringing legal proceedings against her for constructive dismissal, unfair dismissal. I had arranged this with my lawyer to be delivered the day after my final day. According to the office assistant, she went pale and started crying before leaving the office to call her lawyer. She refuted my claims for constructive unfair dismissal, said it was gross misconduct, tried to come up with some more reasons for firing me. But the truth was that the company was making less money because of her business practices, and I was the highest and only salary. I had evidence that I was a great employee. I had evidence that she asked me to move to a 0-hours contract. She initially tried to deny this, since the gross misconduct fabrication makes no sense if she wanted me to stay. But once my lawyer provided hers with a transcript of the entire meeting, along with a copy of the recording, she knew she was. Still, she let the case drag on for over a year. I think she hoped that the legal fees would lead to me dropping the case. Little did she know my lawyer was working on a no-win, no-fee basis, whilst hers wasn't. She ended up settling out of court. The aftermath. The office assistant who had become a friend quit a couple of months after I left. She hated how I was treated and didn't feel safe working for such an untrustworthy boss. Several former customers contacted me personally to inquire why I was no longer with the company. Apparently, the owner was telling them that I just quit. I informed them that I had been fired for cost-cutting reasons. They moved their business elsewhere. Several offered me jobs. One went so far as to offer me a part-time job and to pay for me to attend college to earn a degree required for them to hire me full-time. This was a lovely offer, but they were one of the customers who were a bit too far away to commute, and I wasn't ready to move. In the end, I found a new job in a different industry where a lot of my skills transferred over. Currently earning more than I was, working less hours, and for better owners. The business is floundering. COVID left the new owner desperate for cash. She cancelled orders but refused to refund customers' money, citing an act of God clause in the contracts. The business Facebook and Google reviews have tanked. Most staff left. The business is still afloat, but barely. TLDR. Owner fired me as a cost-cutting measure. I sued and they ended up settling out of court, whilst the person they planned to replace me with quit. This malicious compliance was flawless. By leveraging legal knowledge and professionalism, OP turned the owner's ultimatum into a 12-week notice period while exposing her lies and showcasing his incompetence. Simply, the compliance was a flawless justice served with precision. Kudos to OP. Story from golden_silver61. Table of Karens make my waiter training a living nightmare. A malicious compliance story. Back in 2014, I was hired to work on a cruise ship. I started off as a lowly restaurant steward, busting tables and mopping floors in the buffet. After a few months, I was promoted to back waiter and was moved to the main dining hall. I quickly caught on to the back waiter duties. My front waiter, who we'll call Bert, not his real name, took notice of my hard work. After a couple of weeks in my new position, Bert told me that it's only a matter of time before I get promoted to front waiter, and he wanted to start training me on how to be one. So he told me to shadow him when the next group of passengers were seated in our section so I can observe how he did his front waiter duties. Unfortunately for us, the next group of passengers seated in our section was an 8-top of Karens. Bert and I welcomed them to the restaurant. They were friendly at first, and the head Karen, an older, heavier-set man, asked, "There is a show in the main theatre we want to see that begins in about an hour. Is it possible for us to get our dinners, eat it, and get to the show on time?" To which Bert says, "Absolutely, depending on what you order." After looking over the menu, the Karens were ready to place their order, and 5 out of 8 of them wanted the New York steak, the one single menu item that took the longest to cook. Bert told them this, and that if they all wanted to order the NY steak, that there is no guarantee that we can get them their dinners fast enough to eat and be able to get the show on time. Bert suggested alternative dishes that we could get out much quicker, but the Karens refused to change their orders. Bert read the order back to the Karens, and they all confirmed that it was correct. This is important for later. Bert handed me the ticket, and I ran back to the kitchen to assemble their meals. My first stop was the NY steak counter, and, to my horror, there was a line a mile long of waiters waiting to drop off their tickets. Just so you know, this ship has a max capacity of about 3,500 passengers. The main dining hall seats nearly 1,000 people, and I have never seen the NY counter as busy as it was this night. It seemed like everyone and their mothers were ordering the NY steak. I would have to wait at least 20 minutes just to drop off my ticket, and God knows how long afterwards, till the cook got to my ticket in order to cook them. With the wait time and juggling the other tables Bert and I had to wait on in our section, I knew there was no chance the Karens can get their meals and make it to the show on time. So I rushed out to Bert, told him what the ETA was on the NY steaks, and that he needed to tell the Karens that they needed to change their order. Otherwise, they will miss their show. Bert relayed my message to them. He came back to me and said that they still refused to change their order. Bert shrugged his shoulders and said, "Bert, well, we did all that we could to try and convince them to change their order so they can make it to the show they wanted to see, but they refused to change it. So if they miss their show, they miss it, and it will be their fault." I did my best to get their meal as quickly as possible, while also waiting on the other tables in our section. Sure enough, the Karens missed the start of the show, and they were pissed. They demanded to speak to the restaurant manager. They fabricated multiple lies about the crappy service they received, saying that we were lazy, incompetent, purposely dragged our feet, and lied about how long they were really waiting for their meals. They said they were waiting over an hour since they got their appetizers, when it was only 50 minutes since they were seated in our section at most. Bert and I told the manager our side of the story. He believed us, said he would try and calm the Karens down, but told us to do our best to get the Karens their meals as quickly as possible so we can get them out of the restaurant ASAP. Finally, the meals were ready. I bring them out to the Karens and hoped that this would be the end of the fiasco. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Two of the female Karens called Bert and I back to the table and complained, "Our steaks are rare. We ordered well done." Bert and I huddled. He looked over his notepad where he had the two ladies' steaks written down as rare. He asked me if I heard them say they wanted rare steaks when we took their order earlier on, and I nodded. Yes. Bert approached them and said, "Bert, ladies, my back waiter and I both heard you two say you wanted rare steaks. I read the order back to you, and you both said that the order was correct." But the Karens responded, "We've never ordered rare steaks in our lives. You two messed up. Take these back. We don't want them. We want brand new steaks." So Bert hands me the steaks and told me to go back into the kitchen and order 2 well-done New York steaks on the fly, which is restaurant lingo, for it's an emergency and we need this order right now. So I rushed back into the kitchen. The NY steak counter was still busier than it's ever been. I rushed to the cook and asked for 2 well-done NY steaks on the fly. The cook angrily yells at me, "No one is getting anything on the fly tonight. You get your ass to the back of the line and wait your turn like everyone else." At this point, I began to panic. It was going to be at least another 40 minutes, if not longer, for the 2 Karens to get their well-done steaks. In an alternate reality, this would be a r/malicious compliance story, where I make the Karens wait the near hour-long time for them to get their new steaks as they requested. But I didn't want Bert to deal with the Karens any longer than he had to, and the restaurant manager did tell me to do my best to get them their meals ASAP so we can get them out of the restaurant as quickly as possible. So cue the malicious compliance. The Karens wanted well done. They're going to get well done. There were microwaves in the kitchen. I flipped the steaks over to hide the previously made cut marks, threw them into the microwave, and nuked them till they were well done. I brought them back out to the Karens and prayed to every deity I could think of that they wouldn't realize what I have done. Fortunately, they didn't. The Karens ate their meal in complete silence, giving Bert and I the dirtiest glares while doing so, and stormed off when they were finished. Once they left, I told Bert what I did. It took him a moment to process what I told him, and he finally said, "Bert, under normal circumstances, I would be very upset with you, and I strongly suggest that you never do what you just did ever again. However, these aren't normal circumstances. Those people were rude, unreasonable, liars, and they didn't even tip. So you know what? Them. I'm glad they missed their show. In the near 2 years I've worked on that ship, I've dealt with many Karens. Stories for another day. But I'll never forget this one. Just a reminder to everyone reading this story to please be kind to your waiters. The malicious compliance was perfect and was executed strategically. Such rude customers should be banned from restaurants. No matter what is one's role and what is one's job, everyone deserves respect. People who don't respect their subordinates must be treated the way OP did. Kudos to OP teaching Karens a bitter lesson. The story from Epic Sausage 69. Only do what is in my job title? Fine. Good luck paying employees. So, I work for a construction company as an inventory admin. My job is to basically schedule counts of our warehouse and input the numbers they give me for inventory. Then try to see what the problem is when the numbers on the last count and current count don't add up. There is a little bit more to it, but I will not bore you with the specifics. The problem with this job is that when you have been doing it long enough and are good at it, there is less work to do. In the beginning, when counting one rack out of 60 racks of material would take a few days, it was fine because I was always busy. But now that everything is in order, the entire warehouse can be counted in 3 days. This leaves me bored for most of the time. So, to fix this, I studied up on our cloud-based ERP service that we use for all internal and external transactions and have become sort of an expert on it. Every single aspect of this company uses this ERP service to do their job. Timesheets, HR, payroll, accounting, scheduling, management, manufacturing, ordering from vendors, delivering, inventory, etc. all runs through this ERP service. So it is very important that this service is up and running perfectly 24/7. I became so proficient in this service that our VP decided to cut ties with our consultants of the ERP because I could do what they did but better, quicker, and much cheaper. For reference, we were paying these consultants $5,000 a month just to be on standby if we needed them for some sort of problem that could arise from using this ERP and had to dish out more money to fix those problems depending on how many hours of their time was spent to fix said problems. Not sure on their exact rate, but it was something like $200 an hour, and they took weeks to fix anything, while I could fix the problem in time for my daily afternoon break. I never got an official job title or raise of any kind for being an expert on this service. The company just saw me being able to do it and let me fix things that happened, so they no longer needed the outside help. I wasn't too upset because it gave me something due, so I was glad to help the company save money, even if none of that money fell my way. Skip ahead a few months. We now have a new warehouse manager, and someone in the warehouse something up in inventory by sending a bunch of materials to the wrong job with no records of it being shipped. We are talking $500,000 here. In the same day, our ERP had an update that caused a bunch of bugs with our accounting department. So I decided to work on the ERP problem first because the warehouse is more of a delay and not actually stopping anybody from doing their job at the moment, while this accounting problem means our bills are not able to be paid. You can guess what kind of issues we will have if bills are not paid. The ERP bugs turn out to be quite big and numerous, so it ends up taking me a couple days to figure out, but I fix it before any bills are actually due and decided to take lunch a little early to celebrate a victory. Crisis averted. New warehouse manager storms into my office after I get back from lunch and is livid. Apparently, the bosses were pinning the blame on him for the warehouse and considering he is the one who oversees shipments and personnel in the warehouse, the blame is rightfully placed. He starts laying into me, asking why I have not fixed the problem yet, yelling and screaming like a child. I tried explaining that I was fixing an ERP issue, and have not had time to look at the warehouse problem yet. He gets even more angry and notes that it is funny how I have time to take early lunches, but not do my job. That started to piss me off, but I held my tongue and kept calm about the situation. He then ordered me to only do what is in my job title and to leave the ERP to the people competent enough to handle it, as he put it. Since this guy was technically my supervisor, I had no choice but to obey. I asked him to send me that in writing, and he snarks and storms back into his office. 5 minutes later, I get an email stating that under no circumstances am I to work on anything related to ERP, unless it involves inventory. QMC. I do nothing but inventory from that point forward, knowing damn well that we would be essentially coasting until we hit a problem that I would refuse to fix. Sure enough, not even a week later, I get an email from HR that some sort of bug in the ERP system was preventing them from accessing payroll to pay employees this week. I reply an apology that I am no longer able to work on ERP bugs due to supervisor, and to refer to the ERP system help guide for further assistance. I knew the help guide was not going to help her in the slightest, but it was no longer my problem, so I was not going to deal with it. Skip a few days later to Friday. I checked my bank account in the morning before getting to work and laughed because there was no money deposited. That problem never got fixed. I hurry up and get to work, excited to see the chaos unfold. And what I was expecting was an understatement. When I show up to work, I see the entire warehouse staff of 50 people walking out of the front door. I stopped one and asked why they are leaving, and they replied with, "I didn't get paid today, so I am not coming back until I do." I go into the office and see the warehouse manager in a panic. He has jobs that need material and nobody to load it onto trucks or deliver. I ask him if he needs help with anything, and he just screams at me to leave his office because he is getting phone calls out the arse from superintendents of jobs asking why our material has not arrived yet. I pass by HR on the way to my office and see a bunch of the bosses huddled up over her computer with her, with angry and confused expressions on their face. I guess trying to figure out the problem. I felt bad for her because it really was something out of her control, but I knew she would ultimately be okay because she had been there for so long that they would never fire her. When I get to my office, I see the VP waiting for me there. He has a very pissed off expression on his face. When we get inside, he demands to know why I did not fix the problem in HR when she emailed me about it. I replied that I am no longer allowed to work on ERP problems as it is not in my job title. He has the most shocked look on his face and asked why all of a sudden I had a change of heart. I show him the email from warehouse manager and I could see the dots connect in his head. He immediately storms out and I see him heading straight to the warehouse manager's office. They were in there for a few hours, but eventually he comes back to my office. He seems calmer now and asks me politely if I can fix the problem in HR and if I can resume fixing the ERP if needed. At this point, I liked the relief of responsibility and told him I would only do it if he put it officially in my job title along with a raise. His calmness turned to anger again, and he says, "I cannot believe you," as he storms out and returns to his office. A few hours later, he sends out a mass email that he has hired the old ERP consultants to fix the problem and that next week everyone would be paid for the money they are owed, along with the money they earned if they return to work. This one surprised me as he would rather pay over $60,000 a year to consultants than give me a few extra bucks an hour for better work. I think he expected me to change my mind and just do it for my own paycheck. But I decided to wait because I knew how these consultants were. And if they managed to fix this problem in a week, I would streak naked through the office. Most of the warehouse staff agreed to return, but were still upset about not getting paid. Sure enough, next Friday comes around. Nobody gets paid again. At this point, it is becoming a real problem, and the entire staff is becoming agitated. They have bills to pay. I even heard a bunch of the warehouse talking about some competitors nearby they could go work for. At this point, I even considered just fixing the problem, because the warehouse didn't deserve to be treated like that due to poor management. Maybe I am the asshole here for this, but I am severely underpaid, and can barely afford my apartment. There is no reason I should do extra work for free. That same day, the VP returns to my office and hands me papers. These papers said that I would be promoted to a newly created position that dealt with inventory to ERP upkeep. It would be its own department, and he would be my direct supervisor. Also came with a hefty raise. All I had to do was sign and agree. I looked up at him after reading the paper, and he had the saddest look on his face. Please just sign it. The consultants said it would take them weeks to get around to fixing it due to the high volume of clients they have taken on, and we cannot keep skipping paychecks. I happily signed it and immediately got to work on the HR issue. Managed to even fix it that same day. It was just a simple problem with the permissions of HR and payroll in the ERP due to the update. TLDR. I was doing work outside my job title. Supervisor gets mad and tells me no. I stop, and company is unable to pay employees for 2 weeks. Vice President finally caves in and gives me promotion to do said work outside my job title, along with a raise. The malicious compliance was perfect, and it was executed flawlessly. By following Manger's orders and leaving the ERP system alone, OP exposed management's short-sightedness and incompetence, and the management only understood OP's value when they came under heavy pressure. BTW. The compliance was masterclass. Story from Kole Karmot. If you don't like the way I teach, why don't you complain to someone about it? So today at work, we were talking about my rather bad handwriting, and it reminded me that perhaps the proudest moment of my life could be considered malicious compliance. If it is not, I apologize. But the reason why I am posting this is because I did what I did with the intention to get my teacher in trouble, which worked in the long term, but I did not expect the events to follow my compliance to occur. This story is also quite long, which I also apologize for as well. This took place roughly 19 years ago when I was in middle school. I had, and still have, a disability that prevents me from writing legibly. However, my parents quickly learned I had an insane typing speed. As a result, my ADHD psychologist and parents got me an Alpha Smart word processor for my 5th grade Christmas present. It would be an understatement to say this was a life changer. My assignments became so much easier. I knew the stuff but couldn't write it down. My attitude about school changed, and I became the hip popular kid at school for having this fancy new piece of cutting-edge technology. None of my teachers between the 5th and 7th grade had an issue with this, and were quite impressed by the technology. Mind you, word processors weren't exactly new, but seeing them in schools were unheard of at this point, as they were quite expensive. This changed in the 8th grade with Mrs. Grump. Mrs. Grump was your traditional old woman who looked like my great-great-grandmother. Grey hair, wrinkles upon wrinkles, a bead necklace that reached past her breasts, flower print outfits, and clip-on earrings. Seriously, she was one bobbed hairdo away from being Karen's grandmother. First day I took my word processor out, she was on my back. Anytime she saw me with it, she would threaten to take it from me and reduce my marks for the class. I recall myself standing up for myself the first time. But I was never one to argue with my teachers. I never needed to because my teachers up until then were completely understanding. When she said no, I backed off. At that point, school became miserable for me. When I typed up my assignments, Mrs. Grump lowered my marks for not being handwritten. Anytime I asked her if I could stay after class to finish my assignments or finish writing down my notes, she would lower my marks on the next assignment for wasting her time. Anytime asked a friend for help while in class, you guessed it, she would lower my marks. Luckily, as most of my fellow students understood my problems, a group of them approached me and offered to help me. They started offering me their notes each evening so I could bring them home and photocopy so I could keep up with everything. We also hung out in the library at lunches, and they actually helped me with my handwriting so it could be at the very least legible, allowing me to write out my homework, despite it taking super long. I genuinely don't know what her problem was, but she began reducing my marks because of poor handwriting and inspecting my binders to make sure I wasn't stealing other people's work. If she found a photocopied note, say it with me, She would lower my marks. This was absolutely ridiculous, as none of my classmates were marked in such a way. Now, as I explained, I am not one to question authority. Despite being miserable with Mrs. Grump's attitude, I quietly accepted I would probably fail. Unfortunately, I don't remember why my parents didn't help, but I think it might have been due to my older brother being part of Mrs. Grump's in the past, and they thought I was being overdramatic. ADHD, remember? With the background out of the way, on to the compliance. I don't know what happened this particular day, but I had a sudden surge of confidence. It was a particularly bad day. I remember we were doing an assignment involving microscopes in class. We needed to describe what we saw, and instinctively I brought out my word processor. I put it on the table and looked down into the microscope, but when I came back up, Mrs. Grump was standing at my desk with my word processor in her hand. "Mrs. Grump, I am confiscating this and throwing it away." Me, stuttering. "But I need it and it's expensive." "Mrs. Grump, too bad. I have warned you many times not to bring it out in my class. You didn't listen, and so these are the consequences." At this point, she put it in her cabinet unit and shut the door. Everyone in the class was silent, and Mrs. Grump sat back down. Some of my classmates tried to calm me down. I was crying, and Mrs. Grump didn't care. In particular, I recall, of all people, one of the students who usually bullied me trying to cheer me up. We'll call him Jim from now on, as Jim now works as a coach at a gym now. I didn't work on the assignment, and when Mrs. Grump came to take my blank sheet, she scoffed. "And if you don't like the way I teach, why don't you complain to someone about it?" I left the classroom, defeated. But to my surprise, during lunch, Jim came up to me with my word processor in hand. He stole it out of the teacher's cabinet while she was returning the microscopes to the lab. He told me he was going to keep it in his locker till after school when he'll return it. That way, I wouldn't get in even more trouble when she finds it missing. It was at that moment when I snapped. I don't know what it was. Maybe the fact that the person who had bullied me for so long was the one helping me. But I wanted Mrs. Grump gone. But what was I going to do? Well, complain to someone, of course. She is the teacher, and it's not like me to disobey the teacher. Now, in any other situation, I honestly don't think this would have worked, but I got extremely lucky in regards to the events that followed this decision. So myself and Jim went to the school's principal during lunch. Me and the principal, up until this point, had never officially met, as she had just started at the school this year after the previous principal retired. We are going to call the principal Mrs. Awesome. Mrs. Awesome was eating at her desk and was surprised to be interrupted, though she did sigh when she saw Jim. I know for a fact those two were well acquainted. I think she thought the two of us had gotten a fight, so she asked me to sit down and for Jim to wait outside. I started explaining to her what happened in class, and after she realized Jim wasn't to blame, she called him back in to support my story. When I mentioned the word processor, however, her eyes lit up. Despite never formally talking before, it was clear she knew who I was. The discussion shifted to the word processor itself, and she asked me to go over its functions and everything. I showed her how I could type on it, transfer the files to a computer to either print off or email. The typing tutorials loaded on it. I explained why I needed it, showing her my handwriting and how I had relied on it since the 5th grade. She and Jim seemed quite interested in it, taking notes and everything. At the end of the impromptu tutorial that lasted, Mrs. Awesome thanked me and had us step out for a moment. After she brought me back in, she explained to me that there was nothing she could do at this point in time. She gave me an out-of-school suspension for a week, but explained I was not in trouble at all, and it wasn't being marked against me. The explanation I believe she gave was for stealing out of the teacher's cabinet, though I wasn't required to return the word processor. This also got Jim out of trouble as well, which he was thankful for. Mrs. Awesome said that everything will be taken care of next week when I return, and she'll contact my parents explaining the situation. The week I was off, Jim was coming by and dropping off his homework so I could photocopy it and not fall behind. Quite frankly, at first I thought he just wanted me to do his work for him, as it was a complete 180 on how he used to treat me. But we became good friends after this happened. Even asking him today, Jim doesn't recall why he started treated me better after Mrs. Grump took my word processor. During those days, my parents were on the phone constantly. I wasn't aware what was going on, but they bought me a new game, bought takeout a lot. Genuinely, I felt pampered. My parents came in with me when I returned, but rather than to the classroom, I was brought to the school's boardroom instead, where a bunch of people in suits were. My family doctor and ADHD psychologist was also in attendance, which honestly shocked me. Mrs. Awesome explained to me that these were representatives from the school board and that they were extremely interested in my word processor. In hindsight, it was a bit of a dick move for no one to inform me that I was being brought in front of the school board to present my word processor. But I began explaining it like I did to Mrs. Awesome, showing the different functions and such. After I finished, my family doctor and psychologist gave a better explanation than what I gave as to why I needed it and how it helped. And it ended with my parents explaining how it has changed my education and how I enjoyed school. Honestly, I don't recall the immediate response, but a day later, Mrs. Awesome did explain everything to me. Apparently, she was actually a sitting member of the school board who had been standing in as principal that year until they found a replacement. When I showed her the word processor, she saw the potential they had to help students such as her own daughter, who had similar circumstances as me. She contacted the school board about potentially investing in some word processors for each school in the district for the next year, but they wanted to see it first. Again, this was a rather new concept, all things considered. That's why she needed me that day, and why she allowed me to stay home for the week, as there was no rule in place to protect the word processor from being confiscated and possibly destroyed. I still question why I was never informed until the actual meeting, but whatever. Anyways, due to the presentation, I was given permission to continue working on my word processor, much to Mrs. Grump's dismay. She was also required to adjust all my previous marks to remove her deductions. Meanwhile, the school board decided on ordering 5 to 8 word processors for each school in the district for the next year, this school getting 8 as it was a larger school. Students in what was called resource class, basically a class for students who needed extra attention, had the option to sign out the word processors for a day to help work on them in-school assignments. There was an altogether increase of the resource students' marks as a result of this change, I've been told, and the school board began looking into other ways to help students. But what about Mrs. Grump? Other than having to readjust my marks and allowing me to use my word processor, she got off scot-free. It's great and all that, I made a huge difference in my school district. But how did Mrs. Grump get her just desserts for making 8th grade a living hell for me? Well, I don't know if this was mere coincidence, outside interference, or a parting gift from Mrs. Awesome after she returned to her position in the school board. But all resource students coming into the 8th grade had been assigned to Mrs. Grump's class the next year, and as a result, they were signing out the word processors constantly in her class. I learned this because my 9th grade class was right across the hall from her classroom, and windows in the classrooms allowed me to look across into her class to see 4 to 6 students typing up a storm on their word processors. This came to a head, however, when Mrs. Grump took one of the word processors and threw it out the window. After that, Mrs. Grump was asked to retire halfway through the school year and replaced with the sweetest teacher that held ice cream parties for the students that completed all their homework assignments each month. And that, everyone, is probably the proudest moment in my life. Not only did my actions result in students with disabilities getting more resources to help them, but I also watched the worst teacher I ever had the pleasure of meeting get escorted out of the school by security. By popular demand, DR teacher tells me to complain to someone else, ended up changing the lives of hundreds of students by complying and getting a sanctioned week off school. Brief update. I really didn't expect this to blow up like this, so I thought I would elaborate on a few things specifically regarding why I didn't get my parents involved. Asked my mother this, and she recounted this story. I was actually quite embarrassed by my parents at the time due to something that happened in the 7th grade. We went to an overnight camp as a class trip, and my parents were supervisors. My father accidentally set fire to my tent, so I was forced to sleep in their tent instead. Rumours started to go around the school, specifically from Jim, I believe, that, while quickly quashed, left a rather sour impression. Needless to say, I tried my best not to get them involved, such as not showing them my assignments and stuff. They were incredibly disappointed when they learned the truth, but were equally proud I stood up for myself. Also, this took place in Canada, Nova Scotia. I genuinely don't believe I was the one who started the wide use of Alpha Smart 3000 being used across the world in schools, but I do like to think I was the one who started it in the Atlantic provinces. This was really a sweet revenge, and it was executed flawlessly. OP's complaint was not only for himself, but it also changed the entire system for the better. OP's decision to stand for himself led to betterment for many, in fact, the entire district. This is the power of standing up for yourself. Story from Ars-Torok. You are salaried, right? Just stay up for this meeting. Before we begin, dear readers, a brief bit of backstory. I have found that every company has a Todd. You will know who your Todd is, because he is who you call when you don't know who to call. When the unthinkable happens and everything is on fire and there is no hope of salvation, Todd steps in to fix it. Todd spends his entire time just fixing the unfixable. He has been with the company since the dawn of time, knows the true names of several demons, and was in the room when the old magic was written. Our Todd has an elite team to be on call when stuff breaks. Each team member is the highest authority in the company for one specific thing or another. They are the elite. Their word is law, and to question them is to question Todd. Our story begins shortly after I had accomplished greatest goal and became the newest member of Todd's team. Now, my company works with point of sale. We sell computers, software, printers, card readers, and pretty much anything you need to take money from someone else. After years working in the call center, I proved myself worthy of Todd's attention. I interviewed, tested, and became the specialist of third-party integration. My focus is the connection between our product and whatever weird stuff your company wants to use. Examples of this include getting smart lights to change on command from ordering kiosks, letting the staff control the new jukebox you bought with their employee ID cards, or getting the sales data for the day to report to your Canadian counterparts in both French and English, but only if someone buys the poutine Saurus surprise that day, and other fun conundrums that only the client can fathom. It is important to note that during my time in the call center, I was paid hourly. As a specialist, I would be made a salaried employee and would be on call. After accepting the position, I was told that I would have a trial period of 1 month to prove myself. I would remain hourly, but would have a pay increase to more closely match my expected rate as a salaried employee. I would have the title change and new responsibilities of my job, but I had this month to prove I was worth the extra denary. The first day of my new job, we get a call from one of our needier clients. They lay out a series of demands. 1. All of their stores must be upgraded to Windows 10. 2. As each store makes about 10 cars a day, taking them down for a remodel is not acceptable. 3. All of these upgrades must be done overnight while the store is closed. 4. If the upgrade fails, the store must be rolled back that night so that can open hourly. 5. The window of time to do one of these upgrades is 8 hours. 6. The fastest they have been able to do one is 10 hours. All of this means one thing. They need a specialist to do the upgrades, one that knows their integration. I give Todd the put me in coach nod and a deal is struck. Todd is about to leave on vacation, which leaves me under the control of Steve, the director of the support center, who used to be my boss before I worked for Todd. I am now on overnights. 4 nights a week I upgrade these stores. I supervise 2 to 3 technicians who are on site in separate stores. I do all the software. They do the hardware. This process is staggered based on time zones, so I generally am pulling 12-hour shifts. The OT is amazing, especially paired with the raise I got. Fast forward a week or two. The initial batch does not go the best. I have a 40% failure rate. This is due to scripts provided to both the client and me by the various third-party companies used by the stores, including their music, food delivery, and credit card processors. Everyone on their side knows who is the bad guy here. Talks are in place, and we are moving forward. A meeting between the client and us is scheduled near the end of the week, right in the middle of my off time. As I said, I am working 12 hours a day. I live a full hour from work, and for security reasons can't do these upgrades outside the office. I have 10 hours to eat, sleep, get up, and eat again before work. Once I get to work, there are no breaks on the upgrade train, no lunch, no stopping. So I get home around 11 a.m. each day. The meeting is set for 4 p.m. I can't get any reasonable sleep before the meeting or after. Steve demands that I be there to account for my failures. I already have another specialist designed as my proxy for these sort of meetings because sleep is a thing. I also explain that I am still hourly, but he won't hear it. He insists that I need to be there to explain why the project is going so poorly, and that my explanation better not just be throwing other people under the bus. He tries to explain that I am salaried and therefore need to be there when the company needs me, especially when I am the one who is screwing up. Again, I try to remind him of my probationary period, but he won't listen. And there, my friends, begins the malicious compliance. I clock in at 10 p.m. the day before the meeting. I do my upgrades, all 3 of which are successes, due to what I assume is a change in the third-party backend. The scripts I am provided with work perfectly this time, and all goes well. The corporate contact I report to in the morning tells me the meeting is just to go over the new changes to procedure we went through that night, and I will get the Cliff's notes in my email. No need to attend the meeting. I thank them and sign out. Then I sit. For 6 hours I twiddle my thumbs, take a lunch break and a car nap, and wait for the meeting. When it's time, I walk upstairs to the top floor and the conference room, where everyone but Steve is shocked to see me. I calmly take my place and wait for the meeting to start, stating that I was asked to be here. The meeting lasts 30 minutes and consists of the new procedure, praise for my diligence, and a quick overview of how the timetable will change because of the past failures. It is noted that my performance has prevented a lot of the sites from failing when they would have otherwise, and the client is pleased with my work. Steve, who had previously blamed me for the failures, sheepishly agrees that I was a good fit for the project. Then the meeting ends with the best part. The person giving the talk states that she knows I am asleep right now, so she will go over the changes with me personally when I get in tonight. Meanwhile, the guy I asked to sit in on the meeting for me will work with them to set up the changes to be deployed. About 3 hours of work, so that it's all ready when I get in at 10. The meeting ends. Steve makes a comment about the changes being done by someone with more experience and hints that it should be my responsibility. I cheerfully say that rather than waste my co-workers' time, I will just do the changes myself. I have my 3rd or 4th wind by now and am ready to go. At the end of day 2, I have spent 36 hours at work. Caffeine is my only salvation, and we are almost done. Near the end, I am basically waiting for a technician at my last store to finish testing, so I tell him to call me and shut my eyes for about half an hour, just to rest a bit. All is well. I get called, everything is green. The vigil is over. 2 of my friends insist on driving me home, where I promptly pass out into the most heavenly sleep I have had in ages. I wake up to an email asking me to head into work for a meeting with HR. It is my day off, so I am kind of perplexed. I head on in and apologize for being fashionably late. The meeting is with the head of HR, who has a report that I was sleeping on the job. There is camera footage of my 30-minute power nap. I calmly explained that Steve had asked me to show up to the meeting and then asked me to stay later to set up the changes, and by the time I took my nap, during what I called my paid 30-minute break, I had been in the building for 35 hours. I politely remind the HR head that I am on my trial period and will be expecting overtime pay for that time. It came out to about 33 hours and change due to my extended lunch break. Todd returned from his vacation and taught Steve a new definition of duties. From then on, he would not be given control over Todd's team when he was away, and we would report directly to the CEO. The project completed without much incident, and I passed my probation with flying colours. Edit. A bit more info, since people are asking. Steve would later be fired several months later due to a similar situation where he threw someone so hard under the bus that everyone stopped and saw how uncool that was. He was replaced with new Steve, who is a superior Steve in every way. The malicious compliance was perfect and was executed flawlessly. By following the orders of Steve and letting the situation spiral down, OP turned the table on his boss with precision. It was a revenge filled with professionalism, perseverance, and justice. Simply, the compliance was masterful. Story from Yen, 1969. You know your rights? Okay, go for it. I've told this story a few times elsewhere, but always get comments about posting here. Background: my ex and I were 3 months into separation, as I kept suggesting divorce agreements, trying to find what she would accept other than take her back and return to bring a doormat for her. I have a good head for legal documents, and understood very early that as much as I would prefer to just burn everything down and disappear, legally it was very likely I was going to be paying alimony, and she was entitled to a fair share of everything. But in a no-fault state with no gender preferences, it did mean a fair share. It was clear that legally I would not get an approval for an agreement heavily biased in her favour. So I kept reworking and sending possible divisions. Every few days for months. She would object to anything that put any responsibility on her, anything that left something of value out of her hands. Anytime I asked her what terms she would be okay with, she would just derail the conversation to something else. Not long into this, I realized that I would need a paper trail, so everything went to email only. Through all of this, I had recognized too that a court would order spousal support, so there wasn't any point in just cutting her off financially. Not a total doormat at this point though. I had moved my direct deposit to a solo account and kept up her weekly cash flow and kept paying the bills. But my final offer in this period was the heavily unbalanced offer of splitting the cars 1 to each, me taking all the debt including her student loans, paying her $3,000 to $4,000 a month for a year so she could get her feet under her and she gets all the stuff. I walk away with my car, my dogs, some tools, and some clothes. No go. Not good enough for her. And so we get to the meat of the story for the MC. 3 months in, I finally get her to agree to a mediator, since I'm getting nowhere. She shows up to the initial meeting, the first time we have seen each other in a while, the second time since splitting. She was staying with her sister. The mediator starts out with the rules of mediation and the agreements to sign. I sign easily, she balks, but signs it finally. One of the relevant terms is that we agree to not file any other legal paperwork. We would come to an agreement and the mediator would file the final court papers on both of our behalf to get the divorce ordered. The mediator starts asking basic questions. And every question, to either of us, results in my ex launching into an irrelevant topic attempting emotional manipulation of me or him. I quickly resolve to grey rock her directly, and only direct my interactions to the mediator. I do my best to ignore her off-topic ramblings and reply to the mediator when she briefly crossed relevancy, like someone falling from a tree and briefly being stopped by various branches on the way down. The peak was when she literally crawled on top of the big table to stick her face in mine to force me to see her and engage in her ranting. The mediator called it quits at that point. He reminded her of the rules she agreed to, gave us homework to fill out, and had us schedule the next meeting with his clerk, 2 weeks out. 3 days later, I get served with a summons to court for a hearing over spousal support. The summons shows the claim my ex made that all I had received from her in 3 months was $130. Oh boy, not true at all. Not to mention in violation of the mediator terms. I end up on a conference call with the ex and the mediator as he tells her that she needs to withdraw the complaint or mediation can't continue. She adamantly insists that she knows her rights. So the mediator ends his involvement, cuts us refund checks minus time worked so far, and exits stage left. I prepare for the hearing. I print out 3 months of bank statements and highlight every transfer to her. Every bill paid on her behalf. Every ATM withdrawal by her card. Over 100 toll bills I received from her just driving through express lane tolls, so I got the elevated license plate fee mailed to me. $13,000 and change. You missed a couple zeros in your complaint, I thought. My final stack of paper was rather thick, so I made and printed an Excel spreadsheet summary for the cover sheet. I also looked up the spousal support rules again. It is 40% of the difference between the income goes from the higher paid to the lower paid. Some little wiggle room, but that's it. Simple. She was currently getting up to 72% of my pay once you factored her bills in. This court hearing was a good thing. Not as good as a mediator and fast resolution, but I wasn't likely to end up screwed more here. Not to mention I had some daydreams of her finding out what lying on court documents might do. Court date rolls around. I show up to court, waiting in the hall outside the family law section. She shows up and plops herself next to me to start going off on me again. I try to ignore her. Then, to keep from engaging, I start a written transcript of her ranting using the back cover of my paperwork folder. Finally, she realized what I'm doing and ends the ranting with, "Oh, I guess you are writing what I'm saying so you can make your friends hate me." They needed no encouragement. She huffs a few seats away and is quiet the rest of the time we waited. The court officer, not a judge, just someone authorized to handle it since it is a simple and clear legal process, finally comes to get us, and we head in. The officer starts the legal speeches, yada yada, then asks my ex if she has anything to add to the complaint. She launches into a roller coaster speech proclaiming all my bad faults, some of which were real, how mean I was to try to divorce her, and how I obviously didn't need any of the money I made because he is just going to live somewhere simple and cheap anyway. Yeah, her words. The court officer returns to the present, like someone climbing down from the kitchen table after seeing a rat run by. And she asks me if I have anything I'd like to say. She can see the stack of paper and eyeballs it as she is talking. I hand over the stack, tell the officer that the summary sheet on top should help clear up the financial points in question, and just verbally start going through the items. At each one, my ex interrupts to give a reason why that item shouldn't count. Every single one. The officer keeps asking her to stop interrupting, but to no avail. We finally finish the list. The officer is shaking her head slightly and says, "Mr. Yen, this court process is to ensure that both parties are doing the right thing. So all of the and gestures to encompass the stack of paper needs to stop right now. We will garnish your paychecks for the amount specified by law and send that to her instead." I know it's a win. I knew it was going to be. She didn't. She sat there all smug as we get into the calculations. I asked for a couple of adjustments to keep the amount of her car payment since I co-signed, and I wanted to be sure the bill was paid. I expected that she would refuse or overspend on other stuff and be unable to pay it. I didn't want to give her the power to trash my credit. The officer agreed. I then asked to keep the insurance payment amount too for much the same reason. Also agreed by the officer. My ex continued to be smug. I know she was thrilled at the idea of getting a court check directly. It sure would show me. Everything wrapped up, we got the totals, signed papers, I handed over a check for the first payment, and the officer got up to make copies of everything. I asked the officer if I could wait in another room while she did, and got an agreement with a bit of side-eye at my ex. I got my paperwork first, with the officer saying, "It might take a few minutes for her to get her paperwork, but you are free to go." I got the hint and left immediately. I had parked a few streets away anyway, another barrier if she couldn't park near me. I got in my car and immediately called my cell carrier and cancelled her phone. Does she want to set up her own plan? I can't answer that. I am obeying a court order to remove her from my accounts. Okay? And worked down the remaining subscriptions I was paying for that she used. I even had the bills in front of me from court with account numbers and customer service numbers right there. I was done and driving home when she started blowing up my phone with incoming emails demanding to know what I was doing. Then texts from her sister's phone. Then calls. I just grinned and didn't answer any of them. She stopped after an hour or so and gave me a few hours of silence. Then an all-caps email with a screenshot of the Netflix inactive account message. OMG, even Netflix. I admit I giggled. The fallout wasn't over though. A month later, after she realized how much less she has from me after winning her case, she files an appeal. It is denied due to lack of reason. A month later, she files a complaint that I wasn't paying her car payment. Just an excuse to get into court. I had been paying it, and I was also pretty confident that even if I hadn't, she didn't know how to get into that loans account. She legally could, just never had cared to learn how. I had a lawyer at this point, and we both go to court. She is going to join by phone. The officer paused before calling and tells my lawyer, "This lady is a piece of work." The validation of that statement will always remain with me. The call goes predictably. My ex makes irrelevant rants. The officer keeps shutting her down. Finally asks my ex for proof that I wasn't paying the car payment, as she is holding statements and check images proving I had. My ex nearly screams, "I just know he isn't so he can hurt me." The officer replies, "I am holding proof that he has paid it and is satisfying his legal obligation. The complaint is dismissed. Thank you," and hangs up on my ex. Divorce took another 10 months, lots more crazy. Teaches her newbie lawyer a hard lesson, and I walked away with even less alimony than the spousal support and only about 60% of the debt. I lost my dogs to her though, my only regret in the outcome. One is certainly past old age limits now, the other is in that range. I still miss them. It was a perfect revenge, executed meticulously and perfectly. She was not only a toxic partner, but also a gold digger woman. Such greedy women deserve the same consequences. By following the legal processes, OP struck a heavy jolt to his greedy wife. BTW, sorry for your loss of your dogs. Story from old_hospital, 9999. My co-worker wanted to micromanage me and didn't like that I talked back, so he reported me to our director. I apologize as this came out to be a bit longer than I wanted it to. For a bit of context, I, 25F, work as part of the sanitization department for a hospital. We have multiple different positions, most of which work on upkeeping the cleanliness of the general areas of the hospital. This, as well as making sure patient rooms and other utilized areas are sanitized regularly to ensure patients and staff are protected as much as possible from any sort of environmental threats. We take out trash from nurses' stations, patient rooms, replace linen, clean the hallways and floors, as well as clean bathrooms daily. I started working about a year before the start of the pandemic, and as such, a lot of our processes have, as you can guess, changed and been more intense since. Our supervisors often come around to each floor to make sure everyone in our department is working properly and being diligent about their cleanings. My position was what we call a float worker. Essentially, I've been trained in every area and will be assigned to cover people who call in sick, are on their days off, or on vacation. This comes with a lot of hurdles, such as trying to remember what order everything needs to be done in every area. We've got approximately nearly 30 different areas. So sometimes I need to ask our supervisors for a quick refresh on things that need to be accomplished over the day if I don't feel comfortable with my memory of the area. The downside to my position is I won't know until I show up to work where I will be for the day. I don't mind this, as it allows me to see a vast amount of the hospital and build a rapport with nursing staff and doctors all around. Usually, if I am covering for someone's vacation or time off, I will know ahead of time, as my posted schedule will have me in their position for that time. Now on to the story. About a year and a half ago, I was scheduled to cover one of our guys who works in the operating room, or for short, for about a month. For a little more context here, our OR team consists of 4 people. One person comes in at 6, my position, which came in at 8, and 2 other positions that come in at 9 and 11. Now, I didn't mind this, as I was well acquainted with the staff there and the area in general since, for a while, I was set to cover the same person at least twice a week at the beginning of the pandemic. On top of that, working for the OR usually came with a fair bit of free time since there wasn't a whole lot to do other than ready the room for the next patient that would be coming through. And the stuff you were assigned to do, other than those rooms, were usually finished before your first break anyway. There was one downside. Steve, 56 million. Steve was our afternoon guy. He came in at 11 and ended shift usually at 7:30, but later if the OR dictated it. He's a scumbag, the sort of person who thinks LGBT people are just mentally ill, and has told me at least twice that I am not built for working and that I should be in the kitchen at home preparing dinner for my husband. I am a very open lesbian and he refuses to accept it. This paired with him being the epitome of a teacher's pet. You did something just a little too slow? He called our supervisors. Overrun with work and you couldn't get to your secondary tasks right away? He called our supervisors. Went to your break just a little bit late because a patient finished surgery 5 minutes before you were supposed to sit down and relax for a tiny bit? Well, you can guess what he would do. Steve was the reason not a lot of people liked to learn how to work the positions in the OR. If the constant calling of supervisors wasn't enough, which trust me, it is for most people, he would insist on commenting on how you did things, try to teach you better ways of cleaning if you weren't being absolutely efficient. He would harass people constantly, especially the women, asking them if they had done this or that, and most of all, he loved to try and boss everyone from our department around. Our other OR guys have gotten used to this by now, and just ignore him for the most part, but I, on the other hand, love to take the piss out of him sometimes just because it's fun. The first week of my month-long stint in Oregon went without most of a problem from Steve, as I am normally very diligent about my work anyway, so I don't leave stuff too long to give him any reason to talk to me. The second week is where the malicious compliance truly takes place. It was one of the busiest weeks of the OR for the year, where we would normally average just under 35 cases a day in our 10-room OR. This week we averaged 52 a day. Cases were concluding in record time, as the nurses and doctors wanted to get the hell out of Dodge before any extra cases could be added on. This meant that our little team of 4, myself, Steve, and 2 other guys, were cleaning a room, right in time to then clean another room. This was the most stressed I had seen any of these guys be, but Steve worst of all. At around noon, rooms were coming out, and our early shift guy had just come back from his lunch, which he had to take an hour and a half late because of all the cases. We cut through the 2 rooms we had left, and I made a quick round of my area to make sure things weren't in shambles before I started to plan on heading to lunch. My area was as tip-top as it could be, so I checked the board before letting the guys know I was heading to lunch since we had some free time before more cases came out. Everyone was okay with this, except for Steve, surprisingly. He stopped me, and this was the back and forth that ensued. Steve, wait, have you checked your sinks? Me, yes, scrubbed them before the morning rush. Steve, how about your trash cans? Me, my God, yes, I checked them. One of them is half full, but I don't see half an hour making that full. Now can I go? I don't want to leave. Steve, what about your hallways? Did you dust them? Me, yes, I did. Now, please leave me alone. I need to get to lunch before. Steve, how about your high dusting? Did you get... Me, Steve, I'm going to ask you once, and only once. Mind your damn business and worry about your own area. And with that, I walked away. Steve very much did not like that at all. I was 10 minutes into my lunch in the OR's break room, halfway through my food, when our department director walked in. She walked over to me, tapped me on the shoulder. I had earbuds in watching an episode of anime I had missed over the weekend, and told me to meet her in our office after our lunch. I asked her what it was about, and she told me we'd talk about it when I got down there. I was pissed to say the least. I knew that little rat had probably told our director that I had hit him or something, and was going to use my little outburst as a threat that caused him undue mental harm, and that he didn't feel comfortable working around me if I was going to act like that. Mind you, I am a 5'4", 130 pounds woman who is sweet as pie, and Steve is 6'3" and pro-lil 230 pounds. As I was finishing my food and watching my episode, I peeked at the monitor on the wall that kept track of patients coming into the room and leaving. Every single room was currently closing up their cases, which meant that my OR team was about to get rocked. I panicked for a moment then. I remembered what had happened with Steve, and I couldn't help myself from laughing a little bit. Cue the sweet malicious compliance. I put my lunch bag away with the other bags in the back of the break room, took the last sip of my soda as I tossed it, and walked out with a grin on my face. On my way to the elevators, I saw they had only done one room so far, and judging on that, I assumed it would probably take them another hour and a half to get everything finished for the rooms. Steve saw me on my way out and stopped me. "Steve, OP, get your hairnet on. We have 9 other rooms that need to get cleaned." Me: "Oh, I'm so sorry, Steve. I was asked to come down to the office by our director. She had something she wanted to discuss with me and told me I had to come immediately after my lunch and to not worry about them." Steve: "But we are getting overrun with work." Me: "I don't see how that is currently my issue. If I don't talk with her, I might get fired for insubordination, so good luck. I'll try to be as fast as I can," and smiled as I turned away. I got down to our office, and the director is sitting with one of our HR representatives. She motions me to close the door and sit down, so I do. Surprised, she pulled me in to talk about the fact that someone, of which she couldn't technically name but everyone knew who was being talked about, came to her with a complaint about a hostile encounter in which I made the person feel uncomfortable. I laughed a little bit and told them what had happened from my point of view. The director just kind of put her head in her hands, and the HR rep had to stifle a chuckle. It got quiet for a few moments, so I asked if I was going to lose my job over this. Our director said that originally it was going to be a strike on my record and some disciplinary actions such as taking some online courses about de-escalation of conflict and hostile work environments, as well as an in-service about what to do when a co-worker and you don't agree on something. But after hearing my side of the story, along with the plethora of other reports made by Steve about people in the department, she said she realized that she probably shouldn't have gotten HR involved until she heard my side of things, and dismissed both the rep and myself. As I walked after the rep, I remembered those times he looked down on me for being a woman. Instead of heading back upstairs to the show that awaited me, I closed the door, turned back around, and sat down. She looked up from her laptop, sighed, and asked what I needed. I just smiled and said, "I'd like to lodge a complaint about Steve." She stared at me for a few moments, then asked me to detail my complaint. Here is the list of things I had gotten her to put into this complaint: micromanagement of peers, creating a hostile workspace, unnecessary reporting of coworkers, bullying, misogyny, discrimination of LGBT coworkers, misconduct. Once told me I like other women because you didn't have a guy who could you good enough. After going through the list, providing examples and approximate dates for said examples, my director just kinda shook her head and put her fingers up to her temple. I looked at her and just said, "Bad day to be Steve?" And she nodded, "Yeah, bad day to be Steve. You can head back to work. I'll talk to him before I leave for the day." I left the office, headed back up to the OR a whopping hour later, and our OR team looked dreadful. Even our morning guy, who is in his mid-30s and has been doing this upwards of a decade, was looking rough. They finished all the rooms. Impressive. They all looked at me, and Steve was the first to say anything. "Steve, took you long enough, bitch? Where were you?" Me: "Oh, don't worry, you'll find out soon enough. My meeting with the director went well." Morning guy: "What happened?" Me: "Oh, well, someone complained about me being aggressive, and it ended up turning into a conversation that would definitely eliminate the hostile work environment that was created here." Steve smiling: "Good. Last thing we need is someone to feel uncomfortable up here. Me. Oh, of course, Steve. Wouldn't want anyone to feel attacked or anything, right? Also, Steve, I had a question for you. Have you checked your break room yet? Last I saw, the trash was overflowing onto the floor. Steve left in a panic, and the other three of us laughed. The fallout. Now, so far, it might seem like this belongs on Nuclear Revenge, but sadly, the fallout wasn't what I was hoping. But it was still sweet to hear. I was informed from our director about what had happened with Steve. Since I was the person who levied the complaint, I was entitled to hear about any actions taken to correct what I had complained about in an attempt to let me see that action was taken on my behalf. She said he would have been outright fired if I wasn't the only one who levied these complaints. While they took it seriously regardless, without other women stepping forward to say anything, they couldn't fire him off of my complaints alone. That being said, Steve was still reprimanded hard and was slapped with 2 strikes, 3 strikes get you fired, and a year worth of online learnings and in-service trainings for things such as discrimination, misogynistic reform, LGBT learnings, etc. He was also told if it was reported he said anything close to what he said to me again, he would be fired and blacklisted from hospitals in the state. In good news, since then, I have become a lead for our day shift. While I maintained my float status, covering people who were sick and whatnot, I did gain a few more dollars an hour, some leadership responsibilities, and most important of all, a fancy title to tell Steve to with. It was a sweet revenge, and it was executed flawlessly. The man who overstepped OP's boundaries and bullied her for being a woman and LGBT received the consequences he deserved. The best part was that OP did take her revenge through legal means.